You will already be too late. That was the final line. 7 words, buried inside a restricted military archive sealed behind encryption protocols designed to survive the collapse of entire governments. No author listed. No official seal. No signature of command authority. And yet, every system that encountered it flagged the same conclusion: priority, absolute. The message itself was short. Too short for something that had triggered such extreme security measures. No preamble. No context. Just a single directive, written in the cold, precise language of a species that had never needed to fear anything. If human forces are confirmed in the operational zone, disengage immediately. That alone would have been unusual. What followed made it impossible to ignore. Do not attempt to outmaneuver them. Do not attempt to outfight them. Do not attempt to understand them in real time. There was a pause in the recording, just a fraction of a second, before that final line appeared, as if even the system hesitated to display it. You will already be too late. The archive listed the message as a post-conflict edition, which meant it had not been written before the war. It had been written after something had gone wrong. Very wrong. The only attached data file was heavily corrupted, but fragments remained, enough to piece together glimpses of what had happened. A battlefield, somewhere near the edge of a collapsed star system. Sensor logs filled with overlapping signals. Ships crowding the same space where no formation should have held. Weapons firing in chaotic arcs, not at enemies, but at each other. And in the center of it all, something that did not match any known fleet signature. Not larger, not stronger, just wrong. The logs attempted to categorize it. Failed. Tried again. Failed again. Eventually, the system defaulted to a placeholder, unknown variable. Then came the final entry. A voice recording. The quality was degraded, the speaker's tone distorted by interference, but the emotion carried through with unsettling clarity. It was not rage. Not even fear in its usual form. It was confusion. The kind that comes when something fundamental, something you have always relied on, suddenly stops working. We prepared for strength, the voice said slowly. We prepared for speed. We prepared for numbers. A pause. Breathing, uneven. We did not prepare for this. Static crackled, swallowing part of the next sentence before releasing it again. They do not follow patterns. They create them, while you are still trying to see them. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it was barely above a whisper. We thought the battle had not started yet. The transmission cut for a moment, then resumed with a final fragment, almost lost beneath the noise. That was our mistake. No coordinates. No identification of the speaker. No official record of the battle itself. Only the warning. Only the aftermath. And one detail that no one could explain. The opposing force, the one that had broken a military doctrine considered flawless for centuries, had consisted of fewer than 50 human operatives. No fleet. No armada. Just humans. Somewhere, in the quiet space between what was known and what had been erased, a war had ended in a way the galaxy did not yet understand. And now, that misunderstanding was about to happen again. Long before the warning was discovered, before anyone had reason to fear a species barely a century into interstellar travel, the Tsar Dominion had already decided how the war would end. They always did. For 312 standard cycles, the Dominion had expanded without interruption. Not through diplomacy, not through negotiation, but through something far more efficient: certainty. Their doctrine was simple and had never once failed. Strike fast. Strike decisively. Demonstrate, beyond any possibility of doubt, that resistance was not just futile, but irrational. Most species did not need to be conquered twice. The first system would fall in hours, the second in days. By the third, surrender transmissions would begin arriving before Dominion ships even entered orbit. Entire civilizations learned, very quickly, that survival was not found in defiance, but in submission. It was not cruelty that defined the Dominion. It was consistency. They did not rage. They did not improvise. They did not make mistakes. And that was what made them unstoppable. By the time the Aurelian Compact realized they were at war, they had already lost 2 outer systems and a third was burning. Trade routes collapsed almost overnight. Refugee fleets flooded inward, carrying fragmented reports. Cities erased, orbital defenses bypassed in minutes, fleets dismantled before they could form coordinated resistance. Every report sounded the same. They were already inside our defenses. They knew exactly where to strike. We never had a chance to respond. The Compact Council convened in emergency session, though the term emergency implied a level of control that no longer existed. Representatives from 5 species sat in a chamber designed for diplomacy, now repurposed for survival. Data projections filled the air between them. Fleet losses, system collapses, predictive models. Every projection ended the same way. Total loss. The timeline varied. 6 months, for if the Dominion accelerated, but the conclusion did not change. There was no scenario in which the Compact held. Not with their current resources. Not with their current strategies. Not against an enemy that had never once been forced to adapt. Fleet Commander Redhan of the Viral spoke first, his voice low and controlled. We increased defensive concentrations along the inner systems. Forced them into prolonged engagements. Stretched their supply lines. Across the table, High Strategist Core of the Thal shook his head. They do not have prolonged engagements. Every battle we have recorded ends within a single operational window. They collapse resistance before it can stabilize. Then we make them stabilize, Redhan said. Core's gaze didn't waver. With what? Silence settled over the chamber, heavy and absolute. They had already tried. 3 independent mercenary coalitions had been contracted in the early stages of the conflict. Groups with reputations built on surviving wars others could not. Each had deployed with confidence. Each had engaged the Dominion with strategies that had worked for centuries against every known threat. None of them returned intact. One group managed to transmit a partial after-action report before their signal cut. It contained no tactical data, no analysis, just a single line repeated 3 times, as if the sender had run out of ways to explain it. They were faster than the situation. The meaning had never been clarified. Now, with the Dominion advancing toward the Compact's core systems, the Council faced a reality no amount of strategy could disguise. They were not fighting a war. They were witnessing an outcome. The final projection flickered at the center of the chamber, its conclusion displayed in stark, unchanging text. Operational viability, 0%. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. And yet, somewhere beyond the data, beyond the certainty of defeat, something had already begun to move. Quietly, unnoticed, completely outside the patterns the Dominion had relied on for centuries. The Council just didn't know it yet. The suggestion did not come from a general. It did not come from a strategist, or a fleet commander, or anyone whose voice typically carried weight in a room like this. It came from someone sitting along the outer ring of the chamber, where aides and analysts observed rather than contributed. Lisa Varon almost didn't raise her hand. Her role was simple: compile reports, track inconsistencies, organize data for those who actually made decisions. She was not here to offer solutions. She was here to record the absence of them. But as the Council sat in that heavy, suffocating quiet, something in her refused to stay still. "Permission to present a supplemental file," she said. Several heads turned. Fleet Commander Redhan studied her for a moment, as if trying to recall whether she had spoken before. "You have something relevant?" "I believe so," Lisa replied, forcing steadiness into her voice. "It does not fit within standard projections." That, more than anything, earned her the nod. Her hands moved quickly across the console, pulling up a file that had been buried deep in archived incident logs, flagged, reviewed, and ultimately dismissed months ago because it did not align with established models. The chamber dimmed as the display shifted. Grainy footage flickered into view. A remote industrial outpost, orbiting a fractured asteroid belt. Minimal defenses. Minimal personnel. According to the overlay, the Dominion had deployed a strike force of over 200 units. The expected outcome had been immediate loss. The footage did not match the expectation. "What are we looking at?" Core asked, his tone edged with impatience. "Gantar Relay Station," Lisa said. "Recorded 93 cycles ago." The video advanced. Dominion forces breached the outer perimeter with precision, exactly as predicted. Entry points secured. Corridors cleared. Movement patterns aligned perfectly with every known engagement model. And then something changed. The lighting in one corridor flickered and cut. A squad advanced into darkness. Moments later, the feed showed them retreating. Not in formation. Not under command. Just falling back. Confused. A ripple of quiet moved through the chamber. "That's not possible," Redhan said under his breath. Gravity plating shifted unexpectedly in another section, sending Dominion units off balance mid-advance. A sealed corridor depressurized at precisely the wrong moment, forcing a withdrawal. Maintenance drones, civilian-grade, were repurposed into moving hazards, blocking choke points and isolating squads from one another. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled, deliberate. How many defenders? Kor asked. Lisa hesitated. 12. That earned her full attention. The footage jumped forward, timestamps accelerating. Day 1. Day 3. Day 6. The Dominion forces were still there, still attempting to secure a station that, by every measurable standard, should have fallen within hours. Instead, they were being delayed, divided, managed. The final segment appeared without transition. Dominion units withdrawing, not regrouping, retreating. The station remained intact. All 12 defenders alive. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Redhan leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the frozen image. What species? He asked. Lisa brought up the final data tag. Human. The word hung in the air, unfamiliar in this context. Kor frowned. That is not a combat-specialized species. No, Lisa agreed. It isn't. Then how did they? They didn't follow engagement logic, she said quietly. They didn't try to win the fight. Then what did they do? Lisa met his gaze, feeling the weight of the room settle fully onto her. They made the fight impossible to finish. Silence followed, but it was different this time. Not empty, not resigned. Something else entirely. The particular quiet of a room where everyone is reconsidering something they were certain of a moment ago. Redhan sat back slowly. This is a single incident. An anomaly. Yes, Lisa replied. That's what I thought too. She pulled up a second file, then a third, each one incomplete, each one dismissed, each one ending the same way. Dominion forces failing to secure objectives they should have taken without resistance. Why were these not escalated? Kor demanded. Because they don't make sense, Lisa said. They don't scale. There's no consistent tactic, no repeatable model, just outcomes that shouldn't exist. Refan's eyes narrowed slowly. Or, he said, we have been looking for the wrong kind of pattern. The room shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. Not hope, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A question that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. Lisa swallowed, then brought up one final piece of data. A transmission log. Outbound. Recent. Unauthorized. I sent an inquiry, she said. That snapped the room back to focus. You what? Kor's voice sharpened. To a Terran mercenary unit, she clarified. A small one. Independent. They were referenced in 2 of the incident reports. Refan's gaze hardened. You acted without council approval. Yes, Lisa said. I did. The admission hung in the air, waiting for reprimand. It didn't come. Instead, Redhan asked a different question. Did they respond? Lisa nodded once. Yes. She expanded the message onto the main display. It was brief, professional, almost clinical. Availability confirmed. Requesting full psychological profiles of Dominion command structure. Not tactical, behavioral. There was one final line at the end of the message. No formatting, no signature, just a single sentence. Send everything you have on how they think they win. The chamber felt completely silent. Because for the first time since the war had begun, someone wasn't asking how to survive. They were asking how to break the enemy. The ship did not look like it belonged in a war. It emerged from faster-than-light transit at the edge of the compact's central system with none of the imposing presence that usually accompanied military reinforcements. No escort vessels. No layered defenses. No polished hull reflecting the authority of a unified command. Sections of its exterior plating were mismatched, some clearly newer than others. A docking clamp on one side had been replaced with a model not even designed for that class of vessel. The engine signature fluctuated slightly, as if it had been modified more than once without ever being fully standardized again. And yet, it arrived exactly on time. That's them, Kor asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice as he watched the vessel approach. Lisa stood beside him at the observation deck, her hands clasped behind her back to keep them steady. That's them. Redhan said nothing. He simply observed. There was writing along the side of the hull, large, uneven lettering that took several seconds for the station's translation system to process. When it finally did, the result appeared on the display. If you can read this, you're already in range. No one commented on it. The ship docked without ceremony. No formation. No announcement. No signal of arrival beyond the quiet mechanical confirmation that the airlock had sealed. The ramp lowered, and then they stepped out. There were fewer than expected. Redhan counted once, then again. 38. Not soldiers in the way the compact understood them. Their equipment was functional but worn, customized in ways that suggested personal familiarity rather than standardized issue. Some carried visible sidearms. Others did not appear armed at all. Their movements were relaxed, alert, but not tense. A few glanced around the docking bay with open curiosity, as if they had arrived somewhere interesting rather than somewhere on the edge of collapse. They don't look like a strike unit, Kor muttered. No, Redhan replied quietly. They don't. The last to exit the ship moved differently. Not faster, not slower, just deliberate. He paused at the base of the ramp, taking in the station with a brief, measuring glance before stepping forward. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about him. No visible augmentation, no distinguishing uniform. But the others oriented around him without needing to look. Lisa felt it before she understood it. Command. He approached without hesitation, stopping a short distance from the waiting council representatives. Then he extended a hand toward Redhan, a gesture unfamiliar to most of the room. Dale Carver, he said. His voice was calm, not detached, not overly formal, just certain. Redhan returned the gesture. Fleet Commander Redhan. Carver nodded once, then glanced toward Lisa. You're the one who sent the message. It wasn't a question. Lisa straightened slightly. Yes. Good, he said. That was all. No acknowledgement of protocol. No request for validation. Just a quiet confirmation, as if something had already been decided. We've prepared a full tactical briefing. Kor interjected, stepping forward. Enemy fleet movements, defensive projections, engagement simulations. Carver shook his head once. Later. Kor blinked. Later. Carver's gaze shifted briefly toward the observation window, where the distant glow of the system's star reflected faintly across the glass. I want something else first. What? Redhan asked. Carver looked back at them, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something behind his expression. Not arrogance. Not confidence. Focus. Take me to your analysts. Kor's tone tightened. You'll have full access to all strategic data. But if you intend to operate within our command structure, you will need to understand the battlefield first. Carver didn't argue. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to phrase something in a way that would land correctly. I don't need to understand your battlefield, he said. I need to understand theirs. That was the first moment something shifted in the room. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone to name it. But it was there. Because until now, every plan, every projection, every failed attempt had been built around one assumption. That the war would be fought on the same terms it always had been. Carver was not rejecting that assumption. He was ignoring it entirely. The briefing did happen, eventually. For hours of detailed analysis. Projections layered over projections. Simulations designed to account for every known Dominion tactic. Fleet movements. Engagement probabilities. Defensive fallback lines. Carver listened. He did not interrupt. He did not question. He wrote very little. When the final projection faded and the room settled into that familiar heavy silence, Redhan leaned forward. Well, Carver closed the data slate in front of him. Then he asked his first, and only, question. Which of their commanders is most afraid of looking weak? Kor frowned. That's not relevant to. It's the only thing that's relevant, Carver said calmly. No one had an immediate answer, because no one had ever thought to ask. Carver nodded once, as if that confirmed something he had already suspected. All right, he said, standing. We'll start there. He turned to leave, the rest of his unit already moving without instruction, dispersing into the station with quiet efficiency. No formation. No orders spoken aloud. Just motion. Lisa watched them go, a strange unease settling in her chest. They didn't ask for weapon specs, she said quietly. Redhan didn't look away from the doorway they had exited through. No. They didn't ask about fleet strength. No. Lisa hesitated. Then what are they doing? Redhan was silent for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice was lower than before. They're not preparing for a battle, he said. He paused. They're preparing for something else. And somewhere deep within the station, Far from the observation deck and the carefully structured logic of military planning, the humans had already begun. Whatever they were building, it didn't look like war. The first incident did not trigger an alarm. That, more than anything, was what allowed it to happen. A Dominion supply depot, positioned deep within secured territory, far beyond any projected reach of compact resistance, simply stopped responding. Routine check-ins failed. Automated status reports ceased. The silence was subtle enough at first to be dismissed as a minor communications fault, until it didn't correct itself. A reconnaissance unit was dispatched. They expected sabotage, damage, evidence of forced entry. What they found made no tactical sense. The depot was intact. Every structure stood exactly as it should. No blast marks. No signs of combat. Internal systems were functional, though partially disassembled with almost surgical precision. Power reserves had been drained, not destroyed, not sabotaged, just emptied. And the garrison? Alive. All 14 of them. Found seated in the central storage bay, restrained using their own equipment. No injuries. No signs of struggle. Just confusion, raw and unfiltered, written plainly across expressions that had never needed to understand defeat in this form. The report they submitted contained no useful data. Only a single recurring detail. They hadn't heard anything. No alarms. No movement. No indication that an enemy had been present until it was already over. The Dominion command structure processed the incident efficiently. An anomaly. Contained. Security protocols reviewed and reinforced. Then they moved on. Because nothing in their history suggested this was the beginning of anything. It wasn't. Not yet. The second incident came 4 days later. A patrol vessel responded to a distress signal within an asteroid field near a primary transit corridor. The signal was authentic, encoded with Dominion emergency markers, verified across multiple channels. There was no reason to question it. The ship exited faster than light travel on approach, its sensors scanning for debris, life signs, any indication of a damaged craft. Instead, they found emptiness. For exactly 3 seconds. Then the field activated. Navigation systems collapsed under a sudden gravitational distortion. Communications failed. External sensors returned conflicting data, unable to resolve stable readings. By the time the crew understood what was happening, it was already too late. The boarding took less than 12 minutes. Clean. Efficient. Targeted. No unnecessary movement. No wasted time. When Dominion Command eventually recovered the vessel, it was still operational, adrift, but intact. The crew was alive. Unharmed. The core systems were gone. Navigation data. Communication logs. Encryption keys. Not damaged. Taken. The report that followed contained only fragments. They knew where everything was. They moved like they had been on the ship before. We never saw them coming. Dominion Command did not dismiss this one as easily. 2 incidents. Different methods. No consistent signature. No identifiable pattern. That was unusual, but not yet concerning. The third incident changed that. A forward command officer returned to his operations center to find every tactical display had been replaced. Not corrupted. Not erased. Replaced. Where strategic overlays should have been, there was a single image repeated across every screen. A simple figure, one hand raised, thumb extended upward. The meaning was unclear. The implication was not. Something had entered a secured command environment, altered systems without detection, and left again without triggering a single defensive response. That was not possible. Not within Dominion operational parameters. And yet, it had happened. By the fourth incident, the pattern began to emerge, not in the events themselves, which remained inconsistent and impossible to categorize, but in the effect they produced. Confusion. Not localized. Not contained. Spreading. Each report forced a re-evaluation of assumptions that had never needed to be questioned before. Security protocols were updated, then updated again. Patrol routes shifted. Verification procedures expanded. And still, the incidents continued. Different locations. Different methods. No repetition. No predictability. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting a doctrine built on certainty, the ability to anticipate, control, and resolve conflict before it could evolve into something more complex. Now, for the first time, they were encountering something that refused to stabilize. On the compact station, Lisa watched it unfold in silence. Reports came in fragments at first, intercepted communications, partial data leaks that didn't seem connected until someone placed them side by side. Always human. Always the ones who found the thread first. They're not targeting infrastructure, Lisa said quietly, studying the compiled data. Redhan stood beside her, arms folded. No, they're targeting expectations. Across the room, Carver leaned against the edge of a console, listening without interrupting. Core turned toward him. You've done this before. Carver shrugged slightly. Something like it. You're destabilizing them. For what purpose? You're not slowing their advance significantly. Not yet. That's not the point, Carver replied. Then what is? Carver glanced toward the projection. Dominion movement patterns beginning to shift, small deviations from established models accumulating in ways that hadn't been visible a week ago. They've never had to question themselves, he said. Lisa felt something tighten in her chest. And now? Carver's gaze lingered on the data for a moment longer before he answered. Now they are. Far beyond the reach of the compact's defenses, within the controlled certainty of Dominion space, something subtle had begun to fracture. Not their ships, not their weapons. Something deeper, something far more dangerous. For the first time in their recorded history, the Dominion was no longer sure what was happening. And they had no idea it was only the beginning. The Dominion did not panic. They adapted. That was what they had always done. Refine, reinforce, respond. Their command structure had been built on the assumption that, given enough information, any opponent could be understood. And once understood, defeated. So they increased their control. Verification protocols doubled, then tripled. Every transmission required layered authentication. Patrol routes overlapped until entire sectors became saturated with surveillance. Command decisions slowed, not from hesitation, but from precision. Nothing moved without confirmation. It should have stabilized the situation. It didn't, because the more they tried to control the system, the less it behaved. A convoy rerouted to avoid a compromised corridor arrived late, only to discover the destination had already been cleared of supplies hours before their departure. A reinforced garrison received orders to hold position under all circumstances. Those orders were confirmed, verified, then overridden, also confirmed. By the time the contradiction was discovered, the garrison had split its forces between two conflicting directives, leaving both positions vulnerable. The outpost was taken without resistance. No losses, no fight, just absence. Every adjustment created another inconsistency. Every correction revealed something they hadn't anticipated. And the more they reacted, the more they exposed the one thing their doctrine had never been built to handle: uncertainty. Fleet Admiral Zyrell did not believe in coincidence. He had commanded 16 campaigns, each executed with the same precision that had defined the Dominion for centuries. He did not rely on instinct. He relied on structure, on patterns, on outcomes that could be predicted, controlled, and repeated. Now, for the first time, those patterns were breaking. He stood alone in the command chamber aboard the Dominion flagship, the holographic display before him filled with shifting data, movement reports, incident logs, projections that no longer aligned with reality. They are fragmenting our response structure, one of his officers said. Zyrell didn't look at him. No, he replied quietly. We are fragmenting it ourselves. That was the part that unsettled him. Not the incidents themselves, but the way they forced reaction, forced deviation, forced decisions that would never have been made under normal conditions. The enemy was not overwhelming them. They were guiding them. Subtly, deliberately. What do they gain from this? The officer pressed. They are not engaging. Not directly. Zyrell remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, they are teaching us something. What? Zyrell's eyes narrowed slightly. How we behave when we are no longer certain. On the compact station, the shift was just as visible. Intercepted Dominion communications had changed. Not dramatically, not enough to indicate collapse, but enough to notice. Reports contained more qualifiers, more confirmations, more redundancies. Language that had once been direct, absolute, was now layered with caution. Lisa read through one transmission twice before setting it aside. They're asking questions, she said. Core frowned. Of course they are. That's what command structures do. Not like this. She pulled up the comparison. Previous reports, decisive, efficient, outcome-focused. Current reports, conditional, uncertain, seeking validation. Redhan studied the data. They're hesitating. Carver gave a small nod. Not yet, but they're getting there. Kor turned toward him. You're not weakening their forces. You're not reducing their numbers. This doesn't win wars. It does, Carver said. Just not the way you're used to. Kor's voice sharpened. Then explain it. Carver looked at the projection, the subtle deviations, the growing inconsistencies. They've spent centuries building a system that works perfectly, he said. Every part of it depends on the assumption that the next step is predictable. He paused. So we make it unpredictable. That creates confusion, Kor said. Exactly. And then, Carver's gaze shifted, meeting Kor's directly. Then they start making decisions based on that confusion. The first real fracture came sooner than expected. A Dominion strike group, tasked with reinforcing a contested sector, received conflicting intelligence regarding enemy presence. One report indicated minimal resistance. Another suggested a coordinated trap. Both reports were verified. Both were wrong. The commander hesitated. Not for long, but long enough. By the time the decision was made to proceed with caution, the opportunity for decisive action had passed. The sector stabilized, not because of compact resistance, but because the Dominion had failed to act with its usual speed. It was a small delay, measured in minutes, but it had never happened before. Zyrel saw it immediately, not as a failure, as a signal. He stood over the updated projections, watching as timelines shifted, slightly, but unmistakably. They are not attacking our strength, he said slowly. They are attacking our timing. No one responded, because there was no counter to that. Timing was everything. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the Dominion was losing control of it. On the station, Lisa felt it too. Not in the data. In the silence between updates. Something was building. Not visible yet. Not fully formed. But inevitable. She turned toward Carver, who was already moving toward the exit. You knew this would happen, she said. He paused briefly, glancing back. I knew it could. That's not the same thing. No, Carver agreed. It's not. Lisa hesitated. Then how do you know when it's enough? Carver considered that for a moment. Then he said, you don't. And with that, he stepped out of the room. Fleet Admiral Zyrel made his decision without hesitation. That, more than anything, proved the humans had succeeded. Not because he was careless, not because he lacked discipline, but because he had reached the one conclusion his entire career had trained him to trust. End it with overwhelming force. The reports, the inconsistencies, the growing uncertainty, they were variables, disruptions. But they had not broken his fleet. They had not destroyed his command structure. The Dominion still held the advantage in every measurable way. So he would remove the variables. All of them. All fleets in the region were ordered to converge. 40 warships. Every available asset. A single coordinated strike through the Kat-Haris transit corridor. Fast, decisive, final. No delays. No fragmentation. One movement. One outcome. The order spread through Dominion space with absolute clarity, cutting through weeks of confusion like a blade. For the first time since the incidents began, the structure stabilized. Commands were direct again. Execution timelines precise. The Dominion was returning to form. On the compact station, the shift was immediate. They're consolidating, Kor said, watching the incoming data with rising urgency. All forces. One push. Rethan's expression darkened. They're forcing a decisive engagement. Lisa turned toward Carver, who stood at the edge of the command floor, reading the same projections without visible reaction. This is what they do, she said. This is how they win. Carver nodded once. I know. Kor stepped closer. Then we need to respond. Reposition the fleet, reinforce the inner systems. No, Carver said. The word wasn't loud, but it stopped everything. Redhan narrowed his eyes. Explain. Carver looked up. This is the move we've been building toward. Kor's voice sharpened. Building toward? That's their entire fleet. Exactly. The room went still. Because there was only one way that statement made sense. Lisa felt it before she understood it. The realization forming, incomplete but undeniable. You're not trying to avoid this battle, she said slowly. Carver met her gaze. No, you're waiting for it. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The corridor was quiet. Empty space stretched for hundreds of thousands of kilometers, a stable transit route used for faster-than-light jumps across the region. No anomalies. No disturbances. Every scan confirmed it. Clear, predictable, safe. Exactly as the Dominion expected. 40 warships entered in tight formation, their navigation systems aligned, their timing synchronized to perfection. The fleet moved as one. A single, unstoppable force cutting through space with the certainty that had defined every victory before it. For a moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Then the corridor collapsed. Not violently. Not with the explosive chaos of a weapon strike. It simply failed. Navigation systems flickered. Stabilization fields fractured. Faster than light transit unraveled in an instant, forcing the entire fleet back into real space without warning. 40 warships dropped out of transit simultaneously. Too close. Too aligned. Too unprepared. For half a second, nothing happened. Then everything did. Sensor systems lit up with overlapping signals, ships occupying the same tactical space, defensive systems interfering with one another, firing solutions unable to resolve clean targets. Commands overlapped. Corrections conflicted. The formation, the perfect, controlled formation, had become a liability. And waiting on the other side was the compact fleet. They had been there for 6 days. Engines cold. Systems minimal. Hidden in the quiet assumption that nothing would be waiting. Every firing solution calculated. Every angle prepared. The moment the Dominion fleet dropped into real space, the compact opened fire. From 3 directions. Simultaneously. On the station, the battle unfolded in silence. No one spoke as the projections updated in real time. Dominion ships struggling to reorient. Defensive systems colliding with their own formations. Command signals delayed just enough to matter. They can't stabilize, Core whispered. Redhan said nothing. He was watching something else. Not the destruction. The pattern. Every movement the Dominion attempted, every correction, every reformation, led them deeper into disadvantage. They're reacting, Lisa said quietly. Carver stood beside her, eyes fixed on the shifting data. They've been reacting for weeks. On the battlefield, Admiral Zyrell understood. Not all at once. Piece by piece. As the structure he had trusted his entire life failed to reassert itself, the realization took shape. This was not a failure of execution. It was not a flaw in his command. It was designed. The corridor. The timing. The formation. Every decision he had made had been anticipated. Guided. He wasn't fighting the enemy. He was standing exactly where they wanted him to be. Zyrell closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Then opened them. Disengage, he ordered. It was the first retreat command he had ever issued. It was also too late. The battle lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, 23 Dominion warships had been destroyed. 17 more were disabled or in retreat. The fleet, once considered unbeatable, had been broken. Not by superior force, not by overwhelming strength, but by something far more precise. On the station, the final projections settled into stillness. The war had changed. Not gradually, not incrementally, completely. Lisa turned slowly toward Carver. You planned this, she said. Carver didn't look away from the display. We set the conditions. That's not the same thing. No, he said quietly. It's not. She hesitated. Then what is? Carver finally shifted his gaze, meeting hers. This, he said, gesturing toward the aftermath of a battle that should never have been lost, is what happens when an enemy spends the whole fight reacting and never once realizes they're doing it. The Dominion did not collapse. It unraveled. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, like a structure that had been perfectly balanced for so long that no one noticed the weight it carried until something shifted beneath it. The loss of the fleet did not end the war in a single moment. It did something far more profound. It removed certainty. Without the forward fleet, without the unbroken chain of victories that had always delivered submission before doubt could exist, the Dominion's presence in occupied systems began to weaken. Not because they lacked strength, but because they no longer knew how to apply it. Orders were still given, but now they were questioned. Positions were still held, but now they were abandoned, just in case. And every hesitation, every delay, every second spent considering instead of acting, gave the compact something it had not possessed since the war began. Time. Systems that had been taken without resistance were reclaimed the same way, not through overwhelming force, but through pressure applied in ways the Dominion could no longer predict. Supply lines fractured under their own overcorrections. Garrisons withdrew too early or held too long. Command structures, once seamless, began to operate out of sync. The war did not end with a final battle. It ended with the absence of one. Admiral Zyrell was not executed. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He had expected interrogation, punishment, some form of retribution that aligned with the scale of his failure. Instead, he was given a room, a window, and time to think. The meeting was arranged without ceremony. No council, no audience, just a single table, 2 chairs, and a human already waiting when he entered. Dale Carver looked exactly the same. Calm, unremarkable, composed in a way that defied the weight of what he had done. A cup rested on the table in front of him, untouched. Another sat across from it. For Zyrell, he did not sit immediately. His gaze shifted to the object placed between them, a data slate, its contents already open. Recognizable. It was Dominion Doctrine, translated and highlighted. A single section marked clearly in the center of the display. Never engage an opponent who does not respond predictably to demonstrated superiority. Such opponents have already accepted their own loss and will ensure you share it. Zyrell stared at the text for a long moment. Then, slowly, he sat. You knew, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Carver nodded once. It helped. Zyrell's gaze lifted. You built your strategy around our doctrine. No, Carver replied calmly. We built it around your assumptions. A pause. Zyrell considered that, then asked the only question that still mattered. When did the battle begin? Carver didn't hesitate. Before you knew there was one. The answer settled heavily into the space between them, because it explained everything. The delays, the incidents, the fractures in decision-making that had seemed small at the time but had led, step by step, to a moment where an entire fleet had moved exactly where it was expected to. Not forced, not trapped, guided. Zyrell exhaled slowly. We prepared for strength, for speed, for numbers. Carver said nothing. We did not prepare for an enemy that would change the shape of the fight itself. Carver leaned back slightly in his chair. Most don't. Silence followed. Not tense, not hostile, just the particular quiet of 2 people sitting with something true. After a moment, Zyrell spoke again. You lost soldiers, he said. Carver's expression didn't change. Yes. And yet you continued the operation without deviation. Carver's gaze lowered briefly, to nothing in particular, before returning. Yes. Zyrell studied him. In our doctrine, loss is calculated, managed, reduced to numbers that can be absorbed. Carver nodded faintly. That's one way to do it. And yours? Something shifted in Carver's expression then, subtle, but real. His voice, when he answered, was still calm. But there was weight behind it now. We don't treat it like a number. Zyrell didn't look away. Then how do you continue? Carver held his gaze. Because stopping doesn't bring them back. The simplicity of it landed harder than any strategic explanation could have. No doctrine, no abstraction, just a decision. Zyrell sat with that in silence. Because for all the analysis, all the models, all the assumptions he had built his understanding of war upon, that was the variable he had never accounted for. Not tactics, not technology. Resolve. The Dominion requested negotiations in the 7th week after the corridor battle. It was the first time in their recorded history. The terms were reasonable, territory returned, reparations agreed upon, monitoring protocols accepted without resistance. There was no attempt to reframe the outcome, no effort to preserve the illusion of control, because that illusion was gone. The message that followed spread quickly, not as propaganda, not as a warning issued by enemies, but as a record, a correction embedded into operational doctrine where it could not be ignored. It did not describe the battle in detail. It did not attempt to explain what had happened. It simply stated a conclusion. Human forces represent a non-compliant variable. A pause. Then the final line. Engagement is not advised. On the compact station, the humans prepared to leave as quietly as they had arrived. No celebration. No ceremony beyond what was required. They moved through the docking bay with the same calm efficiency, their ship waiting, unchanged, unimpressive, exactly as it had been. Lisa stood near the ramp, watching as they boarded. Carver was the last. He paused when he reached her. Good call, he said. She blinked. What? Sending the message, he clarified. That's where this started. Lisa hesitated. You're the one who ended it. Carver shook his head. No, they did. She frowned slightly. The Dominion? Carver glanced back toward the station, toward the space where the war had been decided long before the final battle. They chose to keep playing by rules that stopped working, he said. A beat of silence. And you? Lisa asked. Carver met her gaze one last time. We just didn't. He turned, walking up the ramp without another word. The hatch sealed. Moments later, the ship detached, drifting away from the station before slipping cleanly into faster-than-light travel. Gone. Just like that. Much later, deep within Dominion space, a newly appointed commander reviewed the updated doctrine files. He paused when he reached the final directive. Read it once. Then again. His subordinate, standing nearby, shifted slightly. Sir, is it accurate? The commander didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the text. Then, slowly, he said, yes. A pause. Because if it isn't. He closed the file. We won't survive finding out. Across the galaxy, in quiet systems and crowded trade routes alike, the same understanding had begun to take hold. Humans were not the strongest. They were not the fastest. They were not the most advanced. But they were the only ones who, when the rules of war stopped working, did not stop with them.